Good evening, dear listener. Come, settle in with that warm cup of tea you've prepared, perhaps with a biscuit or two. Let the day slip gently away as we spend some quiet time together in St. Mary Mead with dear Miss Marple. Allow the words to wash over you like a soft blanket, easing you toward rest. If these comforting mysteries bring you a little peace, do consider subscribing for more gentle tales to accompany your evenings. Now, breathe deeply and let us begin. In the soft light of an English afternoon, the phrase death before the wedding drifted through St. Mary Mead like a whisper carried on the breeze. It sounded ominous at first, something final, something tragic. Yet in the peaceful lanes and tidy gardens of the village, such words often hid simpler truths, tucked away behind teacups and polite smiles. Perhaps, one might think, the ordinary is never quite as ordinary as it appears. Chapter 1. The quiet beginning. Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair beside the sitting room window, the one with the slightly faded chintz cushions that had once belonged to her dear mother. A soft wool scarf in pale lavender lay across her lap, the knitting needles moving with a slow rhythmic click that had become as familiar to her as the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Afternoon sunlight poured through the lace curtains in warm golden bars, touching the polished oak table, the small vase of late roses from her own garden, and the crisp white envelope that rested beside her teacup. The envelope bore Eleanor's careful handwriting, round feminine letters that tilted just a little to the right. Miss Marple had already read the invitation twice that morning, but she lifted it again now, tracing the words with her eyes as though they might reveal something more with each reading. Mr. and Mrs. The Hargrove request the pleasure of Miss Jane Marple's company at the marriage of their daughter Eleanor Grace to Mr. Thomas Edward Langley at St. Mary Mead Parish Church on Saturday the 21st of June at 2:30, followed by a reception at the Grange. A wedding. Such simple, hopeful words. And yet, in a village like St. Mary Mead, where everyone knew everyone else's business almost before it became their own, a wedding was never quite as simple as the invitation suggested. Though there were always the small currents beneath the surface, likes and dislikes, old favors remembered, small slights half forgotten, family expectations quietly pressing against young hearts. Miss Marple set the card down and took up her needles once more. The lavender wool slid smoothly between her fingers. She had chosen the color carefully. Lavender reminded her of old-fashioned sachets tucked into linen drawers, of quiet summers long past, of things that endured without making a fuss. Our Eleanor would like lavender, she thought. The girl had always preferred gentle colors, pale pinks, soft blues, the creamy white of her favorite roses. Miss Marple had watched her tend the rose bed behind the solicitor's house for years, snipping faded blooms with the same careful tenderness one might use when handling fine china. Eleanor Hargrove was 23 now. Though to Miss Marple, she still seemed very young, slender, with wide grey eyes that noticed more than people realized, and a smile that appeared slowly, as though it had been waiting politely for permission. Her father, the late Mr. Hargrove, had been a kind but rather serious man, much occupied with deeds and wills and the proper drawing up of settlements. When he died 5 years earlier, quite suddenly after a chill that turned to pneumonia, Mrs. Hargrove had been left to manage alone. She had done so with quiet determination, keeping the house exactly as her husband had liked it, attending every meeting of the Women's Institute, and never once complaining that the roof leaked or the boiler made strange noises in the night. And now Eleanor was to marry. Thomas Langley had come to the village 2 years ago, recommended by a cousin of old Colonel Bantry for the position of estate manager at the Grange. The Grange itself had stood empty for nearly a decade after the last of the old Langley family died out. No direct heirs, only distant cousins who preferred London and the Riviera. When the estate was finally let, Thomas arrived with quiet manners, excellent references, and a way of listening that made even the most long-winded tenant feel he had been properly heard. He was tall, with fair hair that was beginning to thin just a little at the temples, and eyes the color of winter fields, grey-green, thoughtful. He dressed plainly but well. Good tweed jackets, polished boots, his shirts that were always crisp, even at the end of a long day in the fields. People liked him. The farmers said he was fair but firm. The village shopkeepers found him polite. The children thought him interesting because he knew the names of birds and could whistle their calls. Miss Marple had spoken with him several times, at the church fete last summer, when he helped carry tables, at the Christmas concert, when he read the lesson in a calm, carrying voice, and once in her own garden, when he had stopped to ask whether she had seen a missing spaniel belonging to Mrs. Price at the bakery. They had talked for 10 minutes about the habits of dogs and the best way to train a puppy not to dig up flower beds. He had listened attentively, nodded at the right moments, and thanked her as though her opinion truly mattered. A steady man, Miss Marple had thought at the time. Steady was a quality she valued highly. In her long experience, flash and charm often faded, but steadiness, quiet, and unshowy steadiness, usually lasted. Outside her window, the village moved in its accustomed rhythm. Old Mr. Curtis pushed his bicycle past, basket loaded with leeks from his allotment. Two small boys raced down the lane with sticks, pretending they were knights on chargers. A blackbird sang from the top of the holly tree, clear and liquid notes that seemed to hang in the warm air. Somewhere farther off, someone was beating a carpet. The rhythmic thwack-thwack carried across the gardens like a slow heartbeat. Miss Marple smiled to herself. Weddings brought people together in the most curious ways. There would be the choosing of music, the discussion of flowers. Eleanor had already said she wanted white lilies and pale pink roses, no bright colors, nothing garish. The fittings for dresses, the baking of cakes. Mrs. Price had already begun ordering extra sultanas and candied peel. Her famous three-tiered fruit cake, it rich and dark and wrapped in marzipan, had graced every important wedding in St. Mary Mead for 30 years. And yet, Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. Weddings also brought things to light, small things usually, a forgotten promise, an old jealousy, a letter tucked away in a drawer that someone had never meant to be found. Not secrets, aye, exactly. Not the dramatic kind one read about in novels, but the ordinary truths that people carried quietly inside themselves until circumstance gently prized them open. She thought of the title that had drifted into her mind earlier that morning, unbidden, Death Before the Wedding. It had come to her while she was still in bed, watching the first pale light creep round the edge of the curtain. The words had felt heavy, almost theatrical, unlike something from one of those melodramatic plays the village dramatic society sometimes attempted. And yet, they had stayed with her all through breakfast, through dressing, through the small morning tasks of watering the geraniums and feeding the birds. Death before the wedding. In a literal sense, of course, it was nonsense. No one was dying. Eleanor was blooming with health. Thomas looked as fit as any man of 35 who spent his days walking the estate. Mrs. Hargrove, though thin and inclined to worry, was in no danger. The village itself was peaceful, the weather kind, the summer promising to be warm and dry. And yet the phrase lingered, like the scent of lavender that rose faintly from the wool in her lap. Miss Marple took another stitch, then another. The scarf was growing slowly, row by row, each loop of yarn a small act of patience. She would finish it in time for the wedding, and she decided, perhaps even wrap it in tissue paper and present it to Eleanor as something borrowed, something old, something made with affection. Outside, the light began to soften. The blackbird fell silent. A breeze stirred the roses against the window pane, tapping gently, as though asking to be let in. Miss Marple smiled again, a small private smile. Weddings, she thought, were very rarely only about the bride and groom. They were about everyone who watched, everyone who remembered, and everyone who hoped. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were about the things that had to be quietly laid to rest before new promises could be made. She turned her head slightly, looking out at the peaceful street. Something, she felt, was already beginning to move beneath the surface of all this ordinary happiness. But there was no hurry. The afternoon was still warm, the knitting soft beneath her fingers, the village drowsy and content. All in good time, she told herself. Mind chapter 2, something slightly unusual. The following morning dawned soft and still, the kind of summer day that made St. Mary Mead feel wrapped in cotton wool. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, drew back the curtains to let in the pale light, and prepared her breakfast with the same unhurried care she had followed for decades. 1 boiled egg, 3.5 minutes precisely. A thin slice of brown bread, toasted just enough to crisp the edges. A scrape of butter, and a pot of tea so strong it could almost stand up by itself. She carried the tray to the small table by the window and sat down to eat, watching the world wake slowly around her. The lavender scarf had grown another few inches overnight. She had worked on it after supper, the fire crackling low, the wireless murmuring a program of light music she barely listened to. Now the wool lay folded neatly on the chair arm, waiting for her next quiet hour. She liked to think of it as a small gift in progress, something warm for Eleanor to wear on cooler autumn evenings after the honeymoon, when the first frosts would touch the garden roses. After breakfast, Miss Marple put on her second-best hat, the navy straw with the little cluster of artificial violets, took up her string bag, and set out for the village shop. She needed a new reel of white cotton thread for hemming handkerchiefs, and a book of stamps for the thank you letters she would soon be writing. The walk was short, only 5 minutes down the lane, but she never hurried. There was always something to notice. The way the dew still clung to the edges of leaves, the faint scent of honeysuckle spilling over a wall, the soft thud of apples dropping from Mrs. Dane's ancient tree into the long grass. As she approached the lych gate of the parish church, she saw 2 familiar figures standing just inside the churchyard. Mrs. Bedingfeld from the post office, and Miss Hart, who kept the little wool shop next to the butcher's. They were deep in conversation, heads close together, voices lowered in that particular tone, reserved for matters both interesting and slightly delicate. Miss Marple slowed her step naturally, as though admiring the climbing roses on the church wall. The roses were in full bloom, creamy white petals edged with pink, and she bent slightly to breathe in their scent, an excuse to linger within earshot. And then Mrs. Hargrove said it quite plainly. Mrs. Bedingfeld was saying, her voice carrying just enough in the still air. There'll be death before the wedding if this goes on. Poor woman looked quite pale when she came in for her stamps yesterday. I asked if she was quite well, and she only shook her head and said, "It's all too much sometimes, Mrs. Bedingfeld." Miss Hart gave a small, sympathetic cluck. Weddings do bring out the strangest tempers, don't they? All those hopes and fears crowded together in one day. I remember when my niece was married. Her mother cried for a week beforehand, saying she felt as though she were losing her forever. But death? Mrs. Bedingfeld replied, lowering her voice even further. That's rather strong, even for Mrs. Hargrove. She's nervous. We all know that. Ever since poor Mr. Hargrove passed. But still. Miss Marple straightened. He adjusted the brim of her hat against the sun and continued past the gate without appearing to have overheard. Yet the words settled in her mind like a pebble dropped into a still pond, sending out small, widening circles. Death before the wedding. She walked on to the shop, greeting old Mr. Eddings behind the counter with her usual gentle smile. He measured out the thread, counted the stamps into her hand, and added, almost as an afterthought, "Lovely day for it, Miss Marple. And they say the wedding's to be the event of the summer. Young Eleanor will make a beautiful bride." "She will indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "And Mr. Langley seems a most suitable young man." Mr. Eddings nodded, then leaned forward slightly. "Mind you, I heard from young Jimmy at the garage that Mr. Langley's been asking questions about the old Langley family plot in the churchyard. Wanted to know if it was still tended. Odd thing to be thinking of just before one's wedding, don't you think?" Miss Marple tilted her head, interested but not pressing. Perhaps he feels a connection. After all, the name is the same. "True enough," Mr. Eddings said, handing her the change. "Distant cousin, they say. Very distant. But blood's blood, I suppose." She thanked him and stepped out into the sunshine again, the string bag swinging lightly from her wrist. The phrase returned as she walked home. "There'll be death before the wedding if this goes on." It was an odd expression, dramatic, almost biblical. Mrs. Hargrove was not given to dramatics. She was a small, neat woman who spoke softly, worried quietly, and preferred to keep her troubles tucked away behind a polite smile. For her to say something so stark, even in a moment of strain, suggested more than ordinary wedding nerves. Miss Marple let herself into the cottage, hung up her hat, and carried the thread to her work basket. She sat down by the window once more, or unfolded the lavender scarf, and began another row. The needles moved steadily, click, 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 a soothing counterpoint to her thoughts. Perhaps it was nothing. People often spoke in hyperbole when they were anxious. A mother watching her only daughter prepare to leave home might easily feel that something inside her was dying. A small, private death of the daily closeness they had shared for 23 years. Or perhaps there had been a disagreement. Something about the arrangements, on the guest list, the honeymoon destination. Small storms blew up and passed in every family before a wedding. And yet, Miss Marple paused to count her stitches. 24, 25, 26. She liked even numbers. They felt balanced, and yet the phrase had a weight to it that went beyond ordinary fretting. It sounded like something quoted, almost like a line remembered from a letter, a conversation, a moment of unguarded speech. And why, if this goes on? What exactly was this? Only she thought of Eleanor's face the last time she had seen her. Only 3 days earlier, coming out of the florist's with a small bunch of trial roses. The girl had smiled and waved, but there had been a shadow behind the smile. Something thoughtful, preoccupied. Not unhappiness, exactly. More like the look of someone turning a puzzle over in her mind, trying to see it from every angle. Miss Marple took up her knitting again. The wool was soft, slightly springy under her fingers. As she worked another inch, then another, letting her mind drift as it always did when her hands were busy. Human nature, she had long ago observed, was full of small contradictions. People said things they did not entirely mean, and meant things they never quite said. Words were like embroidery threads, beautiful when properly placed, but apt to tangle if one pulled too hard. She glanced at the invitation card still lying on the table. The wedding was only 10 days away now, and soon the church would be decorated, the cake iced, the guests assembling in their best clothes. Everything would appear perfect on the surface, as village weddings usually did. But beneath the surface, Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Beneath the surface, there was always something. A dropped stitch, a hidden knot, a color that did not quite match the rest of the pattern. She folded the scarf carefully and laid it aside. Then she rose, went to the kitchen, and put the kettle on for a fresh pot of tea. While the water heated, she stood at the back door looking out over her garden. The roses were opening one by one, pink and white and deep crimson, their petals catching the light like small silk handkerchiefs. Death before the wedding. The words floated through her mind again, quiet now, almost gentle. She would watch, she decided. Not interfere, never that, but simply watch, as one watches a rose unfold, petal by petal, until its true shape becomes clear. The kettle sang. Miss Marple turned back inside, warmed the teapot, measured the leaves, and poured the boiling water with steady hands. There was plenty of time. All in good time. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The days following Miss Marple's visit to the village shop slipped by with the gentle inevitability of summer itself. Mornings began with birdsong and the soft clink of milk bottles left on doorsteps. And afternoons unfolded in warm stillness, broken only by the hum of bees among the lavender and the occasional bark of a distant dog. St. Mary Mead wore its usual air of contented routine, yet to Miss Marple's quiet eye, small shifts were already visible, tiny movements in the pattern, like the first faint trembling of a leaf before the breeze arrives in earnest. She began, as was her habit, with simple, unhurried observation. And on Tuesday, she accepted the vicar's wife's invitation to tea at the vicarage. The garden there was a riot of old-fashioned flowers, delphiniums in deepest blue, sweet peas climbing strings in shades of pink and mauve, and a long bed of lilies whose buds were just beginning to show white. Mrs. Clement, plump and cheerful in a flowered apron, poured tea with a generous hand and chatted easily about parish matters. The forthcoming flower show, the need for new hymn books, and the success of last Sunday's collection. And of course, she added, passing Miss Marple a slice of seed cake, Everyone is talking about the wedding. Eleanor came by yesterday to discuss the flowers for the church. She wants white lilies along the aisle. Simple, she said, nothing too showy. And pale pink roses for the font and the pew ends. Such a thoughtful girl. She even asked if we minded if she brought a few of her own roses from home to mix in. For continuity, she said. Isn't that sweet? Miss Marple nodded, sipping her tea. Very like Eleanor. She has always been careful about such things, small touches that matter to her. Mrs. Clement smiled fondly, though I did think she seemed a trifle quiet. Not unhappy, you understand, just thoughtful. I asked if everything was all right, and she only said, "Oh, yes, quite all right, Mrs. Clement. Just making sure it's all perfect." Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. Weddings do require a great deal of thought. They do indeed, the vicar's wife agreed, and poor Mrs. Hargrove is in rather a flutter. She called in last week to confirm the date for the banns, third reading this Sunday, and her hands were quite cold when she shook mine. I suppose it's only natural, an only daughter leaving home. It must feel like the end of an era. Miss Marple murmured agreement, her mind turning over the phrase once more. Death before the wedding. An end of an era, a small death, perhaps, of daily companionship, of the house as it had always been. Yet the words still felt heavier than that simple explanation allowed. On Wednesday afternoon, she walked to the public library, a small stone building tucked behind the high street. She returned a book on herbaceous borders and borrowed another on the pruning of old roses. Nothing urgent, merely an excuse to spend half an hour among the shelves. While she was there, Thomas Langley entered. He carried himself with the same quiet confidence she had always noticed. Shoulders straight but not stiff, steps measured. He greeted the librarian politely, asked for a volume on local manorial history, and was directed to the reference section. Miss Marple, pretending to examine a display of new gardening magazines, watched him from the corner of her eye. He took the book to a table near the window, opened it, and began reading with close attention. But after a few minutes, he rubbed his forehead with the back of his hand, a small, unconscious gesture, and his fingers trembled very slightly. Not enough for most people to notice, perhaps, but Miss Marple had long ago trained herself to see such details. The tremor passed quickly. He turned another page, but his eyes did not seem to follow the lines as steadily as before. Presently he closed the book, thanked the librarian, and left. Miss Marple waited a moment, then approached the same shelf, and the book he had consulted was still warm from his hands. The Langley Family and the Manor of St. Mary Mead, 1650 to 1920. A dry, scholarly volume, full of pedigrees and land transfers. She opened it at random and found a faded photograph pasted opposite the title page. A young man in riding clothes, standing beside a horse, smiling at the camera. Beneath it, in small print, Thomas Langley, 1898 to 1921. A great-uncle, perhaps, or a cousin several times removed. She closed the book thoughtfully and returned it to the shelf. Later that same afternoon, as she sat in her own garden with a cup of tea, Eleanor passed by on the pavement. The girl was carrying a small trug filled with cut roses, practice blooms no doubt, for the arrangements she was planning. She glanced toward Miss Marple's gate, hesitated, then lifted her hand in a small wave. Miss Marple rose and walked to the low wall. "Good afternoon, my dear. Those are lovely." Eleanor smiled, though a little absently. Thank you, Miss Marple. I'm trying to decide which ones will last longest in the church. The pale pinks are prettier, but the whites have stronger stems. They're all beautiful, Miss Marple said gently. You've done them proud. Eleanor looked down at the flowers, then up again. For a moment, her expression was unguarded, something between wistfulness and uncertainty. I keep thinking, once they're cut, they don't last very long, do they? And even the best ones. Miss Marple tilted her head. No, but they give pleasure while they last, and new ones grow in their place. Eleanor nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose that's true. She shifted the drug to her other arm. I must get home. Mother's waiting for me to help with the invitations. We're addressing the last of them tonight. Give her my kind regards, Miss Marple said. I will. Eleanor started to move on, then paused. Now, Miss Marple, do you ever feel that some things are better left undisturbed? Like old roses that have grown in the same spot for years? Miss Marple considered the question calmly. Sometimes. But even old roses need pruning now and then, or they become tangled and stop flowering properly. Eleanor gave a small, uncertain laugh. I suppose so. Thank you. And she walked on, her footsteps light, but her shoulders carrying a slight tension. Miss Marple returned to her chair, picked up her knitting, and resumed work on the lavender scarf. The needles moved steadily, row after row, while her mind sifted through the small observations of the past days. Eleanor, thoughtful, preoccupied, speaking in careful metaphors about cut flowers and old roses. Thomas, steady on the surface, yet with that faint tremor when alone with a book about his family's past. Mrs. Hargrove, fluttering, pale, using words too large for the occasion. And the phrase itself, death before the wedding, echoing quietly through it all. She did not hurry to conclusions. That was never her way. Instead, she let the impressions settle, like leaves drifting onto the surface of a pond. In time, the pattern would emerge, clear, simple, human. That evening, as the light began to fade and the first stars appeared above the holly tree, Miss Marple sat by her open window. The air smelled of cooling earth and night-scented stock. Somewhere, a nightingale began its liquid song, rising and falling in the darkness. She smiled to herself. People were very like gardens, she thought. Some grew wild and free, others were carefully tended, every shoot in its proper place. But even the most orderly garden had its hidden corners, places where old roots ran deep, where seeds long buried waited for the right moment to stir. And sometimes, just before everything was to change, before new growth, new promises, a small death was necessary, not of a person, but of an old idea, to an old grief, an old way of seeing. She took another stitch in the lavender wool. The scarf was nearly half finished now. There was still time. Plenty of time. Chapter 4. A calm contradiction. The invitation to tea at the Hargrove house arrived the very next morning, slipped through Miss Marple's letterbox in an envelope edged with pale blue. The handwriting was Mrs. Hargrove's, small, precise letters that betrayed a faint tremor in the final stroke of each word. Dear Miss Marple, it read, if you are free this afternoon at 4 o'clock, I should be so grateful for your company. Eleanor will be out with the dressmaker until late, and I find myself rather in need of quiet conversation. Tea and scones, nothing grand. Yours sincerely, Margaret Hargrove. Miss Marple folded the note carefully, and placed it beside the lavender scarf, now more than 3/4 complete. She had expected something of the kind. Small invitations like this often came when people felt the weight of unspoken thoughts pressing too heavily. She dressed in her soft grey afternoon frock, pinned on her best brooch, a modest amethyst given to her by an old friend many years ago, and set off at 10 minutes to 4, arriving punctually at the solicitor's neat Georgian house on the edge of the village green. Mrs. Hargrove opened the door herself. She was thinner than Miss Marple remembered, the lines around her eyes deeper, but her smile was warm and grateful. "How kind of you to come," she said, leading the way into the drawing room. "I've set everything in here, away from the front windows. The light is gentler." The room was as Miss Marple had always known it. Rosewood furniture polished to a soft sheen, watercolors of local landscapes on the walls, a low fire burning despite the warmth of the day. On the tea table stood a silver tray with thin china cups, a plate of fresh scones wrapped in a damask napkin, the strawberry jam in a cut glass dish, and a small jug of clotted cream. Everything was perfect, almost too perfect, as though arranged with deliberate care to hold worry at bay. They sat opposite one another in the two wing chairs by the hearth. Mrs. Hargrove poured tea with hands that shook just enough to make the spout clink against the cup rim. "Milk? Sugar?" she asked, though she knew the answers perfectly well. "A little milk, no sugar, thank you," Miss Marple replied gently, and they spoke at first of ordinary things, the weather, promising to hold fair for the wedding, the roses. Eleanor's had won second prize at the flower show last week. The new curtains in the church, velvet, a soft green that would look well against the stone. Mrs. Hargrove's voice was steady during these topics, but her fingers twisted the edge of her napkin into small, tight pleats. After a time, when the scones had been offered and half eaten, and the first cup of tea refilled, only silence settled comfortably between them. Miss Marple waited, as she always did, letting the moment ripen of its own accord. At last, Mrs. Hargrove drew a long breath. "Miss Marple," she began, "I must confess, I asked you here because, well, because I said something foolish the other day. To Mrs. Bedingfeld at the post office. She will have repeated it, I'm sure. Everyone knows everything in this village." Miss Marple inclined her head. "I did hear a phrase mentioned, something about death before the wedding." Mrs. Hargrove's cheeks flushed a delicate pink. "Yes, exactly that. I said it quite without thinking. There'll be death before the wedding if this goes on." And the moment the words left my mouth, I wished them back. It sounded so melodramatic, so final. But at the time, I felt. She stopped, pressed her lips together, then continued more quietly. "I felt as though something inside me was breaking. Eleanor has been so quiet lately. Not unhappy, exactly, but distant. She spends hours in the garden staring at nothing, or she starts sentences and then trails away. And Thomas, he is kindness itself, but sometimes I catch him looking at her as though he is afraid she might vanish if he looks away." Miss Marple set her cup down without a sound. "And you think these silences are connected to the wedding?" "I don't know," Mrs. Hargrove admitted. "I only know that every time I try to speak to her about it, she smiles and says everything is perfectly all right. But a mother knows, Miss Marple. A mother always knows when something is not quite right. And I'm terrified, quite terrified, that whatever it is will grow until it stops the wedding altogether, that we will reach the day itself and something will have died between them, not in a dreadful way, not like an accident or illness, but quietly. The death of hope, perhaps. The death of what might have been. She looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears. So I said those words, and now I feel ashamed, as though I have somehow invited misfortune by speaking it aloud. Miss Marple regarded her calmly. Words have power, my dear, but not always the power we fear. Sometimes they are only echoes of something already there, waiting to be understood. Mrs. Hargrove nodded slowly. I suppose you're right. But still, it frightens me. They sat in silence for a little while longer, the fire crackling softly and the clock on the mantel ticking with slow measured beats. Outside, a blackbird sang from the pear tree in the garden, its notes clear and untroubled. Miss Marple finished her tea and set the cup aside. May I ask you something, Margaret? Of course. When you said those words, death before the wedding, had you heard them before? Somewhere else, perhaps. Mrs. Hargrove frowned, thinking, I don't believe so, or at least not exactly. But Thomas did say something once, months ago, when he first began calling on Eleanor regularly. We were all three in the garden, and he was helping me tie up the clematis. He looked at the old sundial, my husband's favorite spot, and said, very quietly, almost to himself, I've known death before a wedding once. It changes everything. I thought he meant some family tragedy, perhaps a cousin or an uncle. I didn't press him. It seemed private. Miss Marble's expression remained serene, but a small spark of interest lit behind her eyes. And Eleanor, did she hear him say it? I'm not sure. She was picking raspberries at the far end of the garden, but she has always been quick to notice things. They spoke no more of it then. Mrs. Hargrove offered another scone. Miss Marple declined with thanks. They talked instead of the honeymoon. Thomas had arranged a quiet week in the Cotswolds, a small cottage with a garden and views of rolling hills. Safe, peaceful, ordinary. When the clock struck 5, Miss Marple rose. Thank you for the tea, my dear. It was most pleasant. Mrs. Hargrove walked her to the door. Thank you for listening. I feel lighter somehow. Miss Marple patted her hand. You must not worry too much. Things have a way of explaining themselves, given time. She stepped out into the late afternoon light. The green was quiet now, shadows lengthening across the grass. As she walked home, the contradiction turned slowly in her mind. Mrs. Hargrove feared a future death, of love, of certainty, of the wedding itself. Yet the words she had used were not her own invention. They echoed something Thomas had said long before any trouble appeared, something from his past, spoken almost in passing. If the fear was only Eleanor's present doubt, why reach for so dramatic a phrase? And if the phrase belonged to Thomas's history, why did it surface now in his future mother-in-law's mouth, as though it carried a present warning? The two did not quite fit together. Not yet. Miss Marple turned into her own lane. The lavender scarf waited on her chair, needles gleaming in the last of the sunlight. She would work on it tonight, row by careful row. The pattern was becoming clearer, still incomplete, still with loose threads, but clearer. She smiled faintly to herself. All contradictions she had learned over many years held the key to understanding. One simply had to wait until the light fell at the right angle, and the light, she knew, was already shifting. In this chapter 5, a detail revisited. Miss Marple walked home from the Hargrove house with slow, deliberate steps, the late afternoon sun warm on her back, and the scent of cut grass lingering in the air. The village green lay quiet now, children gone indoors for tea, only a few sparrows hopping between the shadows of the lime trees. She carried Mrs. Hargrove's words with her like a small, carefully wrapped parcel, something to be opened later, in privacy, when the light was right. Now back in her cottage, she removed her hat, hung it on the peg in the hall, and went straight to the sitting room. The lavender scarf waited on the armchair, needles tucked neatly into the last row. She did not pick it up at once. Instead, she sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and allowed the afternoon's conversation to replay itself slowly, phrase by phrase. Mrs. Hargrove's fear had been genuine, yet fragile, like a spider's web stretched across a doorway, easily torn by a careless hand. And she spoke of a possible death between Eleanor and Thomas, the death of affection, of certainty, of the future they had planned. But the phrase itself, death before the wedding, had not originated with her worry. It had come from Thomas, spoken months earlier in the garden, almost as an aside. "I've known death before a wedding once. It changes everything." Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. The words had been quiet, private, not meant to carry far. Yet they had carried, first to Mrs. Hargrove's memory, then to her lips in a moment of strain, and now to Miss Marple's careful attention. She rose, went to the small bookshelf beside the fireplace, and took down the parish register she had borrowed from the vicar some weeks earlier, a favor he had granted with his usual mild surprise at her interest in old records. It was not the most recent volume, but one covering births, marriages, and deaths from 1890 to 1930. A thick, leather-bound book with pages yellowed at the edges and handwriting that varied from copperplate elegance to hurried scrawl. She turned to the death section and ran her finger down the columns until she found what she half expected. Langley, Thomas Edward, aged 23, died 14 September 1921. Accidental. Riding accident at the Grange stables. Buried 18 September in the Langley family plot, St. Mary Mead churchyard. Beside the entry, in faint pencil, and someone, perhaps the vicar of the time, had added, "Fiancé of Miss Clara Beaumont. Wedding fixed for 28th September." Miss Marple closed the book gently and returned it to the shelf. She stood for a moment, looking out at her garden, where the last of the day's light gilded the rose petals. Thomas Langley, the present Thomas Langley, had taken the name of a long-dead relative. Distant cousin, the village said. Very distant. But names carry echoes. And sometimes those echoes are louder than people realize. She remembered now another small detail, one she had noted in passing at the time and set aside. Old Mr. Curtis in the village shop, weeks earlier, mentioning that the new estate manager had come to St. Mary Mead after a sad loss. She had assumed, as most people would, the loss of a parent or a sibling. But the date fit too neatly. Thomas Langley had arrived in the village 2 years ago, it almost to the month after the centenary of that other Thomas Langley's death. Coincidence? Perhaps. Yet Miss Marple had learned long ago that what people called coincidence was often only pattern seen from too close a distance. She returned to her chair, took up the lavender scarf at last, and began to knit. The rhythm steadied her thoughts. Click, slide, loop, pull through. Row by row, the soft wool grew. Eleanor's behavior made sense now in a different light. In the thoughtful glances toward the grange, the way she had spoken of old roses better left undisturbed. The small, wistful question about things that were cut and could not last. Somewhere, perhaps in a drawer at the grange, perhaps in an old album left behind by the previous tenants, Eleanor had come across a photograph, a letter, a newspaper clipping. A young man in riding clothes, smiling beside a horse. A girl in a half-finished wedding veil, eyes bright with promise. And the date, September 1921. Just before the wedding that never happened. And then, one quiet evening, perhaps while Thomas slept beside her in the armchair after a long day, he had murmured in his dreams, "Death before the wedding." Not a present fear, not a doubt about Eleanor, simply an old grief rising unbidden, spoken aloud in the unguarded moment between waking and sleeping. Eleanor had heard it. She had not mentioned it to her mother. Young people so often keep such things to themselves, turning them over in silence until they grow heavy. But she had carried the words away with her, and they had taken root beside the photograph, beside the story of the other Thomas Langley, who had died so close to his own wedding day. Miss Marple's needles paused. She looked at the scarf. The lavender was deepening now, soft and restful. The stitches even and sure. Mrs. Hargrove had overheard her daughter's silences, seen her preoccupation, and in her own anxiety had reached for the most dramatic phrase she could remember, one that Thomas himself had once used. In her mouth, it became a warning, a prophecy. In truth, it was only memory, echoing across 30 years and two different men who shared a name and little else. The contradiction resolved itself quietly, like a knot that slips free when one stops pulling. There was no present threat to the wedding, no hidden flaw in Thomas's affection, only the past brushing against the present, as old rose roots sometimes push through the soil years after the bush has been cleared away. Miss Marple smiled, a small, satisfied curve of the lips. She had no need to hurry to conclusions or to speak yet. The truth, once seen clearly, needed no embellishment. It simply waited for the right moment to be shared. She worked another row, then another. The scarf was nearly finished, only a few more inches, and then the casting off and the neat weaving in of ends. Outside, the light had softened to the color of old gold. A thrush began its evening song from the holly tree, clear notes falling into the dusk like drops of water. Miss Marple set the knitting aside for a moment and rose to draw the curtains halfway. She left a gap so she could still see the garden fading into twilight. Soon, she thought, she would ask if she might call on Eleanor alone. Not to accuse or pry, but to offer a gentle explanation, to show how the past could cast long shadows without meaning harm to the future. And then the wedding would go forward as planned. Lilies in the church, pale pink roses on the pews, Mrs. Price's famous cake, and vows spoken in the soft light of a June afternoon. The title that had drifted into her mind so many days ago, Death Before the Wedding, no longer sounded ominous. It was simply accurate. A death that had happened long before this wedding, one that had shaped a man but not broken him. She returned to her chair, took up the needles once more, and continued. The pattern was complete now, every stitch in place. All that remained was to finish the work, fold it neatly, and wait for the proper moment to give it away. Chapter 6. quiet explanation. The morning after her visit to the Hargrove house dawned soft and hazy, the kind of gentle mist that promised warmth by noon. Miss Marple rose early, as she always did on days when a small task felt necessary. She prepared her breakfast with the same quiet ritual: egg, toast, strong tea, and then sat for a while by the open kitchen door, watching the garden wake. The roses, still damp with dew, held their petals half closed, as though reluctant to let the day begin too soon. She had decided the evening before she would call on Eleanor alone, not at home where her mother might hover with anxious kindness, but in the place where the girl felt most herself, the rose garden behind the solicitor's house. It was a sheltered spot, walled on three sides by old brick, with a small wooden bench beneath a climbing new dawn rose, whose pale pink blooms spilled over the trellis like a soft shawl. Eleanor often went there in the early hours to cut blooms or simply to sit and think. Miss Marple dressed simply, her grey cotton frock, a light shawl against the morning chill, and set out at 9:30. She carried only her small handbag and the nearly finished lavender scarf, now folded neatly in tissue paper inside a plain brown envelope. The walk took her past familiar gates and hedges. She nodded to Mrs. Price, sweeping her bakery step, and exchanged a word with old Mr. Curtis, tending his leeks. No one asked questions. In St. Mary Mead, people understood that some errands were private. When she reached the Hargrove gate, she did not knock at the front door, but instead she followed the narrow side path that led round to the back garden. The rose bed was just as she remembered: neat rows of bushes, labels still tied to the canes, the air thick with the sweet, clean scent of early blooms. Eleanor was there already, kneeling on a folded sack, secateurs in hand, snipping a spent flower head with careful precision. She looked up at the sound of footsteps on the gravel, surprise giving way quickly to a small, welcoming smile. Miss Marple? How nice. I didn't expect anyone this morning. Good morning, my dear, Miss Marple said gently. I wondered if I might sit with you for a little while. I have something rather small to give you, and perhaps a word or two to say. Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron and rose. Of course. Please. The bench is quite dry now. She gestured to the wooden seat beneath the trellis. They sat side by side, the rose canes arching above them like a protective canopy. A bee droned lazily past, landing on a half-open bud. Miss Marple opened her handbag and drew out the envelope. First, this. It isn't quite finished. I still have to cast off the last few rows properly, but I thought you might like to see it. A small wedding gift. Something warm for the autumn evenings. Eleanor took the envelope with both hands, unfolded the tissue, and lifted the lavender scarf. She ran her fingers lightly over the wool, then held it to her cheek. It's beautiful, she said softly. The color is perfect. Thank you, Miss Marple. Truly. Miss Marple smiled. I'm glad you like it. Now, my dear, if you will allow me, I believe there is something on your mind, something that has made the days before your wedding feel a little heavier than they ought. Eleanor's hands stilled on the scarf. She looked down at the roses at her feet. Mother told you, didn't she? About what she said at the post office. She did mention it, Miss Marple agreed. But what interests me more is why those particular words came to her lips and why they have stayed with you. Eleanor drew a slow breath. I found something. Months ago, when Thomas asked me to help him sort some old boxes in the attic at the Grange. There were papers from the last Langley who lived there, photographs mostly. One was of a young man on horseback, smiling. He looked so like Thomas, it startled me. Then I saw the date on the back, September 1921. And beneath it, in faded ink, Thomas Langley, taken 2 weeks before the accident. She paused, folding the scarf carefully in her lap. There was another photograph folded inside, a girl in a white dress, veil half-pinned, laughing. On the back, Clara, wedding day that never came. I didn't say anything to Thomas then. I thought it was only family history. But later, one night he fell asleep in the chair after supper, and he murmured in his sleep, "Death before the wedding." Just those words, very clearly. I thought my heart would stop. I wondered if he still carried her, if he could ever truly let the past go, if marrying me was only trying to forget. Miss Marple nodded, her expression calm and kind. "And so you began to watch him more closely, to listen for echoes." "Yes," Eleanor admitted. "And the more I watched, the more afraid I became that I was second best, that the wedding would go ahead. But something in him would always be waiting for that other day that never happened." Miss Marple reached out and laid her hand lightly over Eleanor's. "My dear, people carry memories the way they carry old letters, tucked away, not thrown out, because they once mattered. Thomas lost someone he loved very deeply. A riding accident, sudden and cruel, only days before their wedding. He was 35 then. He is 35 now. The years between were quiet ones. Work, travel, is a deliberate choice to live where the name Langley still meant something, even if only to distant cousins and old gravestones." She paused, letting the words settle. "When he came here 2 years ago, he was not running from grief. He was simply ready to begin again. He chose this village, this work, and then he chose you. Not as a replacement, but as someone new. The words you heard were not doubt. They were memory speaking in the dark, the way old wounds sometimes ache before rain. Yet your mother heard your silences, felt your worry, and in her own fear repeated the phrase she remembered from Thomas's casual remark months ago. She turned an old sorrow into a present danger. But it is neither." Eleanor looked up, eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "Then it isn't a sign? Against us marrying?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said gently. "It is only a reminder that love sometimes walks beside loss for a time. Thomas has walked far enough now. He has chosen to step forward with you. The past has not died. It has simply been laid quietly aside so that the present can grow." A long silence followed. Somewhere in the hedge, a wren began its bright, tumbling song. Eleanor lifted the lavender scarf again, pressing it to her lips for a moment. "I've been so silly," she whispered, "carrying it all alone." "Not silly," Miss Marple corrected softly. "Only young and loving and careful of the person you love most. And that is never foolish." Eleanor reached out and took Miss Marple's hand properly this time. "Thank you for seeing it clearly, for coming here." Miss Marple squeezed her fingers gently. "Now finish your roses, my dear. The church will look lovely with them. And when the day comes, walk down the aisle, knowing that what is behind you has no claim on what lies ahead." Eleanor nodded, a small, steady smile breaking through. "I will." Miss Marple rose slowly, smoothing her skirt. "Yeah, I shall see you on Saturday then, in my best hat." Eleanor laughed, a light, relieved sound. And I shall wear your scarf one day soon, when the evenings turn cool. Miss Marple walked back along the side path, past the house, out through the gate. The mist had lifted. The sun was warm now, touching everything with gold. She felt the quiet satisfaction of a small truth gently placed where it belonged. The explanation was complete. No drama, no raised voices, only clear words spoken in a rose garden on a summer morning. The rest, she knew, would follow naturally. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The morning of Saturday, the 21st of June, arrived as though the weather itself had been invited to the wedding and had accepted with perfect manners. The sky was a high, pale blue, the kind that makes old stone buildings look newly washed. A light breeze stirred the leaves without disturbing the flowers. In street, merry Mead. The village moved with gentle purpose. Windows were polished, front steps swept, best hats brushed, and set ready on hall tables. By 1:30, the lanes leading to the parish church were dotted with people walking in small family groups, greeting one another with quiet smiles and soft congratulations. Miss Marple left her cottage at 1:45. She wore her favorite pearl grey silk dress, the one with the modest lace collar, it pinned on the amethyst brooch that caught the light just so. Over her arm she carried a light shawl and a small posy of her own garden roses, pale pink and white, tied with narrow satin ribbon. The lavender scarf, now fully finished and neatly pressed, she had wrapped in tissue and placed in a small box. She would give it to Eleanor later, perhaps at the reception, when the day had settled into its calm rhythm. The churchyard gate stood open, welcoming. Inside, the path was lined with white lilies in tall urns, their scent rising sweet and cool. Pale pink roses had been tucked into every pew end, their petals still fresh with morning dew. Miss Marple paused at the porch to speak to the vicar, who looked unusually splendid in his surplice, his round face beaming. "Everything in order, vicar?" she asked. "Perfectly, Miss Marple. The organist is ready, the bells have been rung, and young Thomas is already inside, steady as ever, though I fancy his hands are a trifle cold." She smiled. A bridegroom's privilege. She entered the church and took her place in one of the middle pews on the bride's side. The interior glowed with soft light, filtering through the stained glass windows. Dust motes danced in the sunbeams like tiny blessings. Guests arrived steadily. Mrs. Price, in a flowered hat that matched her famous cake. Old Mr. Curtis, with his best tie slightly askew. The Women's Institute ladies, in a neat row, whispering approval of the floral arrangements. Mrs. Hargrove slipped into the front pew, thin and composed, dabbing once at her eyes with a lace handkerchief before folding her hands in her lap. Then the organ began, a gentle voluntary, rising and falling like a summer tide. Heads turned. Eleanor appeared at the west door on her uncle's arm. She was beautiful in the simplest way. White silk that fell in soft folds, a veil of fine tulle caught with a single rosebud. No jewels except the small pearl earrings that had been her grandmother's. Her bouquet was white lilies and pale pink roses tied with silver ribbon. As she walked down the aisle, the light caught the veil and turned it almost luminous. Every step was measured, calm, certain. Thomas waited at the chancel steps. He wore morning dress, dark coat, grey waistcoat, a white rose in his buttonhole. When he saw Eleanor, his face changed, not dramatically, not with any theatrical flourish, but with a quiet opening, as though a door, long kept closed, had at last been gently pushed ajar. His eyes, grey-green and thoughtful, held only warmth and steady joy. No shadow lingered there. The past had been acknowledged, understood, and laid quietly aside. The vicar's voice carried clearly through the church. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here, in the sight of God. Miss Marple listened with the same calm attention she gave to everything worth hearing. The vows were spoken without hesitation. Eleanor's voice, soft but sure, Thomas's low and firm. Rings were exchanged, simple gold bands that caught the light as they slid into place. Then the blessing, the final prayer, the declaration that they were man and wife. The organ swelled into the recessional. Eleanor took Thomas's arm, and together they walked back down the aisle, smiling now, nodding to friends, the bride's veil lifting slightly with each step. As they passed Miss Marple's pew, Eleanor glanced toward her and gave a small private nod of thanks. Miss Marple returned it with a gentle inclination of her head. Outside in the churchyard, rice and rose petals were thrown in gentle handfuls. Laughter rose softly. Children darted between legs, collecting fallen blooms. Photographs were taken, formal groups first, and then smaller, laughing clusters. Mrs. Hargrove stood beside her daughter, one hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm, her face softened by relief and quiet pride. The reception was held in the garden of the Grange, long tables set beneath a marquee, white cloths fluttering, silver gleaming. Mrs. Price's three-tiered fruit cake stood at the center, dark and rich beneath its marzipan and icing, surrounded by bowls of strawberries and jugs of cream. Champagne was poured with careful generosity. His speeches were short and kind, the vicar's warm, the best man's light-hearted, Thomas's brief but sincere. Miss Marple found Eleanor later, when the first rush had eased and guests were wandering among the flower beds. The bride had removed her veil and stood in the shade of an old beech tree, the lavender scarf already draped lightly over her shoulders against the faint evening chill that had begun to creep in. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, approaching. Eleanor turned, eyes bright. "Please, I've been waiting to thank you properly." Miss Marple took both her hands. "There is nothing to thank me for, my dear. You found your own way, with a little help from the truth." Eleanor glanced at Thomas, who was talking quietly with the vicar a short distance away. "I told him everything about the photographs, the words in his sleep, how afraid I'd been." He listened without a word of reproach. Then he said, "That was a long time ago, Eleanor. I've carried it." "Yes, but I've never regretted choosing to live again. And choosing you." Miss Marple nodded. "People do carry things, but they also set them down when the moment is right." Mrs. Hargrove joined them then, her face calm at last. "Miss Marple," she said, pressing a hand to her heart, "I cannot tell you how grateful I am. Those foolish words of mine, I thought they might spoil everything, but you made them small again." "They were never large," Miss Marple replied gently, though only misunderstood. As the afternoon faded into evening, the garden lights were lit. Small lanterns hung in the trees, casting a warm golden glow. Guests began to drift home in ones and twos. The newlyweds prepared to leave for their quiet week in the Cotswolds. Eleanor hugged her mother, then turned to Miss Marple once more. "Thank you for the scarf," she whispered, "and for everything else." Miss Marple smiled. "Wear it when you need warmth, my dear, And remember, new beginnings are not built on forgetting the old ones. They are built on understanding them. The couple departed in a small car, decorated with white ribbons. Well-wishers waved until the tail lights disappeared round the bend. The Grange garden quieted. Miss Marple walked home under a sky now deepening to indigo, stars beginning to prick through the velvet. She let herself into the cottage, lit the lamp in the sitting room, and sat for a moment in her armchair, and the room felt peaceful, orderly, as though the small puzzle of the past weeks had been neatly put away. Death before the wedding, she murmured to the empty room. It had meant exactly what it said, a death that had happened long ago, 30 years before this wedding day. A young man lost, a promise unfulfilled, a grief carried quietly until it could be set down without shame. Not a warning, not a curse, simply a fact, now understood, now released. Miss Marple rose. She drew the curtains against the night and turned out the lamp. In the darkness, the cottage settled into stillness. Outside, the village slept. The church clock struck 10, soft and slow. Somewhere, a nightingale sang. All was well. The pattern was complete. Dear listener, let the story rest now, like petals fallen gently to the ground. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and allow the quiet satisfaction of order restored to carry you into peaceful dreams. Good night. To Chapter 8, A Gentle Epilogue. The days after the wedding passed in the slow, contented way that summer sometimes allows itself to linger. St. Mary Mead did not hurry back to its ordinary rhythm. Instead, it eased into it, like someone settling deeper into an armchair after a pleasant afternoon out. The church flowers were carried home by grateful parishioners. The marquee at the Grange was taken down with careful folding and quiet laughter. And Mrs. Price's bakery displayed a small sign for a week. Wedding cake slices, last few remaining, 6 pence each. They sold out by Wednesday. Miss Marple returned to her cottage the evening of the wedding and found the house welcoming her as though nothing had changed, and yet everything had shifted just a fraction. The sitting room lamp burned with its usual soft glow. The grandfather clock ticked steadily in the hall, and the lavender plant on the windowsill released its faint, a soothing scent when she brushed past it. She removed her grey silk dress, hung it carefully in the wardrobe, and changed into a comfortable housecoat. Then she made herself a small pot of tea, weak this time, with a slice of lemon, and carried it to the armchair by the window. The lavender scarf box was empty now. The gift had found its home around Eleanor's shoulders as the sun began to set. Miss Marple smiled at the memory, the young bride standing beneath the beech tree, on the soft wool draped like a promise of warmth to come. She had not needed to say more. The scarf itself had spoken the rest. Outside, the garden lay quiet in the twilight. The roses that had supplied Eleanor's bouquet were already beginning to open fresh buds. Nature's gentle reminder that beauty does not end with one perfect day. Miss Marple watched a late bumblebee move heavily from bloom to bloom, its flight slow and deliberate, as though it too understood that there was no need to rush. Over the following week, she saw small signs that order had truly been restored. Mrs. Hargrove appeared at the Women's Institute meeting on Tuesday, looking rested, her hands steady as she poured tea for the others. She spoke of the honeymoon postcards already received, a view of rolling Cotswold Hills, a short note in Eleanor's neat hand. The cottage is perfect, the garden full of old roses. We are both very happy. Love, E and T. Mrs. Hargrove read it aloud with quiet pride. Even no one noticed the faint tremble that had once lived in her voice. Thomas Langley was seen walking the estate paths each morning, his step light, his greetings warmer than before. The farmers remarked that he seemed more at ease with himself. Even the spaniel belonging to Mrs. Price trotted beside him without hesitation now, as though it sensed the change. In the village shop, old Mr. Eddings mentioned casually that Mr. Langley had ordered a new book, something on rose cultivation, not family history. A small detail, perhaps, but to Miss Marple, it carried meaning. The past had been consulted, understood, and gently set back on the shelf. Eleanor returned from the honeymoon on the following Saturday. Miss Marple saw her the next morning, walking along the lane with a basket of early blackberries she had gathered from the hedgerows near the grange. The young woman wore a simple cotton dress and, tucked loosely around her shoulders, the lavender scarf. The color suited her. He had caught the morning light and made her eyes appear brighter, clearer. They met at the garden gate. "Good morning, my dear," Miss Marple said. "You look well." Eleanor smiled, a smile that reached every part of her face. "I feel well. The week away was quiet, just what we needed. We walked, we talked, we sat in the garden and said very little sometimes. It was enough." Miss Marple nodded. Silence can be a great healer. "I kept thinking of what you said," Eleanor continued, "on about love, walking beside loss for a time, then stepping forward. Thomas told me more about Clara, about the accident. Not because I pressed him, but because he wanted me to know. He said he had carried the sorrow like an old coat, useful once, but heavy after so many years. Taking it off didn't mean forgetting her. It meant making room for something new." Miss Marple reached out and touched the edge of the scarf lightly. "And this?" Eleanor laughed softly. "This is my reminder. Every time I wear it, I think of patience, of small stitches made one at a time, of someone who saw what I couldn't yet see myself. Thank you again, Miss Marple." "There is no need for thanks," Miss Marple replied. "You would have found your way. I merely pointed out the path that was already there." They stood for a few moments longer, the blackberries scenting the air between them, the sun climbing higher. Then Eleanor said, "We're planning a small supper next month, just family and a few friends. Will you come?" "I should be delighted," Miss Marple answered. Eleanor leaned forward and kissed her cheek, lightly, quickly, the way young people do when words feel too large for the moment. Then she continued down the lane, basket swinging, scarf fluttering. Miss Marple watched her go until she turned the corner by the lych gate. Only then did she return indoors, and the rest of the summer passed in its usual gentle succession. Long evenings, cricket on the green, the first blackberries turned into jam, the roses fading into hips that would feed the birds through winter. Miss Marple continued her knitting, a new pattern now, soft cream wool for a baby's shawl, though no announcement had yet been made. She simply felt it might be needed one day. Occasionally, the phrase returned to her mind, "death before the wedding." But it no longer carried any weight, and it had become what it always truly was, a title for a small chapter in someone else's story, now closed and filed away with understanding rather than regret. One evening in late September, as the first cool air began to remind the village that autumn was near, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a cup of cocoa and the wireless playing a quiet sonata. She thought of the wedding day, the lilies, the vows, the way Thomas's face had opened when he saw his bride, She thought of Eleanor's relieved laughter in the rose garden, of Mrs. Hargrove's steady hands at tea, of the lavender scarf draped over young shoulders against the evening chill. All the small threads had come together, not with drama or revelation, but with the quiet certainty of everyday human kindness. She set the cup down, picked up her knitting once more, and began another row. The world turned slowly, as it always did. Outside, the stars appeared one by one above the holly tree. A nightingale, late in the season, offered a few last notes before falling silent. Miss Marple smiled into the firelight. Everything was in its proper place. The story, such as it was, had ended not with fanfare, but with peace. And peace, she reflected, was the best ending of all. Dear listener, let these final words settle softly around you like a familiar blanket. The village sleeps, the roses rest, and all is well. And breathe deeply now. Allow the gentle rhythm of the tale to carry you into calm and dream-filled rest. Good night, and may your own small stories find their quiet resolutions too. Chapter 9. The Last Stitch. Winter came to St. Mary Mead with the quiet politeness of an expected guest. The first frost arrived one night in late November, silvering the grass and turning the rose hips into small crimson jewels that caught the weak morning sun. Miss Marple woke to find the windows patterned with delicate ferns of ice. She lit the fire in the sitting room early, set the kettle on, and drew her shawl closer before opening the curtains to let in what light there was. The lavender scarf had long since left her work basket. She had finished it properly the day after the wedding, ends woven in, edges neat, and given the last small touch of care to it, as though it were a living thing. Now her needles moved through new wool, soft cream, fine and warm, for a shawl she had begun without announcement or reason. Only the gentle certainty that somewhere, in time, it would be needed. The village settled into its winter rhythm. Lanes grew quiet except for the crunch of boots on frozen ground. Lamps were lit earlier each evening. The bakery window displayed trays of mince pies and rich fruit cake wrapped in holly-printed paper. Mrs. Price greeted customers with the same cheerful briskness, though she sometimes added, almost as an afterthought, "Young Mrs. Langley was in yesterday, bought 2 loaves and half a dozen of my best ginger biscuits. Said they're expecting a little one come spring." The news had spread slowly, like ripples from a pebble dropped in still water. No grand announcement, only the small, ordinary signs. Eleanor's hand resting more often on her waist, Thomas walking beside her with a new protectiveness, but the way she chose the sunniest bench in the Grange garden when she came to visit her mother. Mrs. Hargrove, once so inclined to worry, now carried herself with a quiet glow. She spoke of knitting baby clothes and choosing names as though these were the most natural things in the world. Miss Marple heard the news on a December afternoon when she called at the solicitor's house with a small jar of her own quince jelly. Mrs. Hargrove welcomed her into the warm drawing room, in where a fire burned steadily and a tray of tea waited already poured. "You've heard, of course," Mrs. Hargrove said, passing the cup with steady hands. "I have," Miss Marple replied, "and I'm very glad." Mrs. Hargrove's eyes filled, but the tears were soft ones, born of relief rather than fear. "I was so afraid, you know, after everything, that the shadow of the past would somehow reach forward and touch this new life. But it hasn't. Eleanor says Thomas talks about the baby the way he talks about the future, calmly, happily, as though it were the most ordinary miracle. Miss Marple sipped her tea. The past does not vanish, my dear. It simply becomes part of the ground we stand on. Stronger ground, sometimes, because it has been walked over and understood. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the fire crackle and the distant sound of church bells practicing for Christmas. Then Mrs. Hargrove said, "I still think of those words I spoke. Death before the wedding. They seem so distant now, almost silly." "Not silly," Miss Marple corrected gently. "Only human. We speak from fear when we cannot yet see clearly. And when the light comes, the words shrink back to their proper size." Mrs. Hargrove nodded. "Eleanor wears your scarf often. She says it makes her feel held, safe." Miss Marple smiled. "Then I am content." Later that afternoon, she walked home through the frosty lanes, and the sky was the color of old pewter, promising snow before nightfall. She passed the churchyard, where the Langley family plot lay neat and tended. Fresh flowers, small white chrysanthemums, had been placed on the grave of the young Thomas Langley, who had died in 1921. She paused for a moment, not out of sorrow, but out of quiet respect. The stone bore his name, the dates, and beneath them the simple inscription, "Taken too soon, but never forgotten." Miss Marple touched the top of the headstone lightly with gloved fingers. "Rest well," she murmured. "Your echo has found its peace." She continued on. By the time she reached her cottage, the first flakes were falling, large, slow, silent. She let herself in, hung her coat, and went straight to the sitting room. The cream wool waited on her chair, the pattern half formed but growing steadily. She sat down, took up the needles, and began another row. Click, slide, loop, pull through. Each stitch was small, deliberate, unhurried. She thought, as she worked, of how stories, real stories, the kind lived in villages and houses and hearts, rarely end with loud climaxes. They end with continuation. A baby expected in spring, a scarf worn against the cold, a gravestone tended with fresh flowers, a fire burning low on a winter afternoon. The title that had once drifted into her mind unbidden, Death Before the Wedding, had long since lost its shadow. It had never been about tragedy waiting to strike. It had been about a sorrow already spent, carried for years like a stone in a pocket, until the moment came to set it down without ceremony and walk on lighter. She worked until the light failed and the snow had thickened outside the window, blanketing the garden in soft white. Then she set the knitting aside, rose, and drew the curtains. The room felt smaller, warmer, enclosed against the winter night. Before turning out the lamp, she stood for a moment at the window, watching the flakes drift past the glass. Somewhere in the village, Eleanor and Thomas would be sitting by their own fire, speaking quietly of names and hopes and the small, ordinary days ahead. Mrs. Hargrove would be knitting tiny sleeves in pale blue or yellow. The church clock would strike the hour, steady and sure. All the small pieces had found their places. Miss Marple smiled into the darkness. She had no need to solve any more puzzles tonight. The one that mattered had resolved itself gently, as such things do when given time and understanding. She lit a single candle to carry upstairs, blew out the lamp, and climbed the narrow stairs to bed. The house settled around her, creaks and sighs of old timbers, the faint tick of the clock below, the hush of snow against the roof. In the quiet, she thought one last time of the phrase, "Death before the wedding." Yes, and there had been a death, long ago, far away in time from this present happiness. But because it had been faced, named, and gently laid aside, life had continued, not in spite of it, but quietly alongside it, until the shadow no longer fell across the path. She slipped beneath the covers, pulled the eiderdown up to her chin, and closed her eyes. The snow fell on, the village slept, and somewhere in the stillness, a new story was already beginning, small, ordinary, full of promise. Dear listener, and let the snow cover the last traces of the tale. Let the fire die to embers, the needles rest, the world grow quiet. Breathe slowly. Feel the gentle weight of peace settle over you. Close your eyes now and drift into the calm, dream-filled sleep that waits. Good night, and may all your own endings be as gentle as this one. Chapter 10. Spring Returns. Spring arrived in St. Mary Mead with the same unhurried grace it always showed, though as though the season had all the time in the world and no intention of wasting any of it. By mid-March, the snow had long melted, leaving the ground soft and dark. The first snowdrops appeared in sheltered corners of the churchyard, then crocuses in brave purple and gold along garden paths. The air carried the clean green smell of new growth, and the blackbirds sang longer each evening, claiming territory with clear, confident notes. Miss Marple noticed the changes from her sitting room window, and the holly tree, so dark and solid through winter, now showed tiny pale buds at the tips of its branches. Her own roses, pruned back hard in February, were pushing out fresh red shoots, vigorous and hopeful. She continued her daily routine without alteration. Breakfast by the window, a short walk to the village shop when the sun was high enough to warm her bones, knitting in the afternoon light, tea at 4 precisely. The cream shawl had grown steadily through the winter months. On row after row of soft stitches, each one added with the same calm attention she gave to everything worth doing. She had not mentioned it to anyone, not even when Eleanor stopped by one February afternoon with a small basket of homemade lemon curd and news that the baby was expected in late April. Miss Marple had simply smiled, offered tea, and listened as the young woman spoke of names they were considering. Grace for a girl, after Eleanor's middle name. Edward for a boy, after Thomas's father. While the conversation had been light, ordinary, full of small certainties. Now, on a bright morning in early April, Miss Marple finished the last row. She cast off carefully, weaving in the final end with the tapestry needle until no trace of loose thread remained. The shawl lay across her lap, light as gossamer, warm as a promise. The cream wool catching the sunlight in gentle waves. She folded it once, then again, and placed it in a shallow cardboard box lined with tissue paper. And on top, she laid a small card in her neat handwriting. For the little one, with love and best wishes for many peaceful sleeps. Jane Marple. She tied the box with narrow white ribbon and set it on the hall table, ready for the proper moment. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday morning, when the apple blossom was just beginning to open in pale pink drifts, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. The news reached the village by lunchtime. First a telephone call to Mrs. Hargrove, and then quiet word passed from house to house, from shop counter to garden gate. By evening, everyone knew. Mother and child well, father quietly proud, the baby small but strong, with dark hair and eyes already alert. Miss Marple waited until the following Tuesday before walking to the Grange. She carried the boxed shawl in one hand and a small bunch of her earliest sweet peas in the other, all lavender and white, fragrant enough to fill a room. Thomas answered the door, his face tired but lit from within. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping aside. "Come in. They're both resting, but Eleanor will be glad to see you." He led her through the hall and into the sunlit morning room at the back of the house. Eleanor lay on the sofa, propped against cushions, the baby cradled in the curve of her arm. The child was wrapped in a fine white shawl, not Miss Marple's, but one borrowed from Mrs. Hargrove's chest of family linens. Eleanor looked up as they entered, on her smile weary and radiant. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you." Miss Marple set the flowers in a nearby vase and placed the box gently on the low table. "I won't stay long, my dear. I only wanted to bring a small welcome for this little one." Eleanor shifted the baby carefully so she could reach the ribbon. She untied it, lifted the lid, and drew out the cream shawl. For a moment, she said nothing, only ran her fingers over the fine stitches. "It's perfect," she whispered. "So soft, so light. She'll be wrapped in it for all her first spring walks." Thomas stood beside the sofa, one hand resting lightly on his wife's shoulder. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It means a great deal." Miss Marple looked at the baby, tiny features still blurred with newness, small fists curled against her chest. "What have you named her?" "Grace," Eleanor answered. "Grace Eleanor Langley." Miss Marple nodded. "A lovely name." "It suits her." They sat together for a little while. Thomas brought tea. No, Eleanor spoke softly of the birth, of the quiet hours and the hospital, of how Thomas had held her hand through the long night and never once complained of tiredness. Miss Marple listened, offering no advice, only the gentle presence that had always been her greatest gift. When the baby began to stir, Eleanor lifted her to her shoulder. Grace gave a small, sleepy cry, then settled again. Miss Marple rose. "I mustn't tire you," she said. "But if there is ever anything, anything at all, you know where to find me." Eleanor reached out and took her hand. "We do. And we will. Thank you for the shawl, for everything before it, for seeing what we couldn't yet see ourselves." Miss Marple squeezed her fingers lightly. "You saw it in time. That's all that matters." She walked home through lanes white with blossom, the air sweet and warm. The village felt full, full of small lives continuing, of ordinary miracles unfolding without fanfare. At the churchyard, she paused again by the Langley plot. The chrysanthemums of winter had been replaced with spring violets. The stone looked almost gentle in the sunlight. She continued on. That evening, she sat by her open window, knitting once more, this time a simple pair of booties in pale pink wool. The fire burned low. The wireless played something soft and orchestral. Outside, the first stars appeared above the roofline, and the phrase that had once drifted into her mind so many months ago, "Death before the wedding," felt now like an old photograph found in a drawer. Interesting, faintly poignant, but no longer carrying any power to disturb. It had been only a marker, a point on the map of someone else's journey. The journey had continued past that marker, through understanding, through love, through new life. Miss Marple worked another row on the booties. Click, slide, loop, pull through. The stitches were small, even perfect in their simplicity. She thought of Grace Langley, wrapped in cream wool against the spring chill, of Eleanor's quiet strength, of Thomas's steady hand, of Mrs. Hargrove's restored calm. All was as it should be. The clock struck 9. Miss Marple set the knitting aside, rose, and drew the curtains against the night. She turned out the lamp. The cottage settled into silence. Outside, the apple blossom drifted on the breeze like soft confetti. Spring had come fully, and with it, everything that spring brings: renewal, quiet joy, the gentle turning of another page. Dear listener, let the story close now as softly as blossom, falling to earth. The village rests, the baby sleeps, the roses wait for summer. Breathe slowly. Feel the peace of things completed and things begun. Close your eyes. Let the last stitch of the tale hold you gently and drift into calm, unbroken sleep. Good night, and may all your seasons be kind.